The boy expected nothing when he helped the woman in the wheelchair down a poorly made ramp. But when her son showed up the next day with an unexpected proposal, he nearly fainted at what was offered to him. The sun beat down on the crowded street. It was loud, chaotic. People moved in every direction, bargaining, shouting, selling. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Marcus. He was tall for his age, with worn-out clothes and a sharp look in his eyes. His curly hair looked like it hadn't seen a brush in days, not that anyone had time for that. The dusty streets were his stage, the cracked asphalt beneath his sneakers, a reminder of what life was like in this neighborhood. Tough, unforgiving. "Marcus, hurry up," his mum called from their fruit stand. She was busy arranging the last of the bananas on the table, her face tense, her eyes tired. Marcus rushed over, his hands already grabbing a box filled with oranges. He set it down next to her, barely looking up. "We gotta sell all of this today," she said, almost like a plea. "No leftovers tonight, you hear? We need dinner money." Marcus nodded. He didn't need a reminder. He could see the electric bill tucked into her apron pocket. The red letters that screamed "Final Notice" were enough of a reminder. The boy kept his eyes on the crowd, hoping for customers, but all he got were people glancing at the fruit and walking past. No one was buying. Not today. Nearby, the owner of the store next door was watching them, a man with a round belly and an angry face. He didn't like them taking up space in front of his store. Marcus could see him frowning from behind the glass door, shaking his head as if they were the cause of all his problems. "Oi! I told you all to keep it down!" the man shouted, stepping out of his shop. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. Marcus's mother kept her head down, her lips pressed tight. "We're not bothering anyone," she replied, but her voice was low, almost defeated. Marcus clenched his fists but kept quiet. He knew better than to talk back. It wouldn't end well, not with his mother there. He wanted to tell the man off, but instead he turned back to the fruit stand, counting apples that didn't need counting just to keep himself busy. By the time the sun started to go down, the box was still half full. His mother sighed, brushing her hands against her worn-out skirt. Marcus watched as she looked at the electric bill again, her face falling even more. She gave Marcus a small, tired smile, but he could see the disappointment. "It's okay, Mum," he said, trying to sound like he believed it. "We'll figure something out." She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. "We have to sell tomorrow, Marcus. No choice." As they began packing up, Marcus noticed an old woman struggling across the street. She was in a wheelchair, trying to make her way down a badly built ramp. The wheels wobbled, and the old woman looked nervous, her hands shaky on the chair handles. Marcus paused, glancing at his mum, then back at the woman. He felt torn. He had his own problems. His mum was staring at those apples like they were the last hope, but the woman needed help. Marcus took a deep breath and made a decision. "Mum, I'll be right back," he called, leaving the box he was holding on the ground. He didn't wait for an answer before jogging across the street, dodging a car that honked angrily at him. He reached the woman, who looked up at him, her eyes wide and a bit scared. "Need a hand?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Marcus took the handles of the wheelchair and started guiding her down the ramp, slowly, making sure the chair stayed steady. It wasn't easy. The ramp was cracked, and one of the wheels kept getting stuck. But Marcus kept pushing, his hands straining against the metal. "Thank you, young man," the old woman said, her voice soft but grateful. She smiled at him, and it was the kind of smile that made Marcus feel warm, even in the middle of everything else. He nodded, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "No problem, Mum." When they reached the bottom of the ramp, she patted his arm gently. "You're a good boy," she said, her eyes kind. Marcus looked away, feeling his face heat up a bit. He mumbled a quick, "Take care," before heading back across the street. His mum was watching him, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, just handed him another box of fruit. He took it, feeling a strange mix of pride and worry. He had helped, but nothing had changed. The fruit still needed to be sold, the bills still needed to be paid. But at least, for a moment, he had done something right. The rest of the evening passed in silence, the two of them packing up and pushing their cart back to their apartment. The cracked sidewalks made the wheels rattle, echoing through the narrow streets. Marcus's mom walked ahead, Her shoulders slumped, and Marcus followed, the weight of everything heavy on his small frame. When they got home, the apartment felt even smaller than usual. 2 rooms, peeling paint, and that electric bill sitting on the counter like a threat. His little sister was asleep on the mattress they all shared, her tiny body curled up under a thin blanket. "Marcus, wash up and come eat," his mum said, her voice tired. She had managed to make something with what they had left, a thin soup, mostly water. Marcus didn't complain. He sat at the table staring at the bowl, thinking about the old woman and the way she had smiled at him. He finished quickly, helping his mom clean up before lying down next to his sister. The darkness settled in, and Marcus stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the light from the street. He thought about the fruit they hadn't sold, about the electric bill, about his dad, who wasn't there to help. And then he thought about the old woman again, and how her smile had made everything else fade away for just a moment. Maybe, somehow, things could get better. But for now, all he could do was close his eyes and hope tomorrow would be different. Morning came with the sound of cars honking and people yelling. The streets were already alive, the same chaos as always. Marcus woke up to his mom shaking his shoulder gently. "Marcus, time to get up. We got work to do," she said. Her voice was low, careful not to wake his sister, who was still asleep. Marcus rubbed his eyes and got up, slipping on his worn sneakers. He walked over to the small bathroom, splashed some cold water on his face, and stared at his reflection. He looked tired, older than 12. His mum was already in the kitchen, such as it was, a corner of their cramped apartment with a stove that barely worked. She was boiling water, her eyes focused on the pot as if that could change anything. "I'm ready, Mom," Marcus said. She handed him a piece of bread, not enough to fill him but enough to keep him going. They ate quietly, no words, just the sound of chewing and the distant noise of the city. "Let's go," she finally said, grabbing her bag and the electric bill. Marcus picked up the crate of fruit, feeling the weight settle into his arms as they stepped out of the building. The air was already thick, the sun glaring down on the concrete jungle they called home. They walked to their usual spot, Marcus pushing the cart while his mum kept looking around, her face tight with worry. As they set up the fruit stand, Marcus noticed something strange. Across the street, there was a black car parked, its windows tinted. It wasn't the kind of car that usually showed up around here. Too clean, too expensive. He watched it for a moment, his brows furrowed, but then he shook it off. They had work to do. "Focus, Marcus," his mum muttered, as if she could read his thoughts. He nodded, setting the apples and bananas in neat rows, trying to make them look like something someone would want to buy. He wasn't sure how much hope he had left for that. The morning dragged on. A few people stopped, bought an apple here, a couple of bananas there. It wasn't enough, but Marcus kept working, his eyes drifting to the car every now and then. It hadn't moved. No one had gotten out. It just sat there, engine off, almost like it was watching them. And then, something happened. The door of the car opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a suit, which made him stand out even more in the dusty street. He started walking towards them. Marcus felt his heart pick up speed. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way the man moved made him uneasy. "Mom," Marcus whispered, nodding toward the man. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. The man stopped in front of their stand, his gaze shifting between Marcus and his mother. He smiled, but it wasn't a big smile, just a polite curve of his lips. He looked like he didn't belong there, his clean suit and shiny shoes too out of place against the broken pavement. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm. "I'm looking for Marcus." Marcus blinked, confused. "Me?" he asked, his voice cracking just a little. The man nodded. "Yes, you. I wanted to thank you for something you did yesterday." Marcus stared at him, his mind racing. "Yesterday?" He glanced at his mum, who was looking at the man with suspicion. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" she asked, her hand resting on the edge of the fruit stand as if she needed something to hold on to. The man turned to her, his expression softening. "I apologize for the surprise. My name is Richard. I'm the son of the lady Marcus helped yesterday, the one in the wheelchair. I was there, in the car, watching. I saw what your boy did, and I wanted to say thank you." Marcus felt a rush of emotions, relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite name. He hadn't thought much of it after he helped her. It was just something he had done, like instinct. He didn't expect anyone to come back for it. "Oh," Marcus managed to say, not sure what else to add. His mother's eyes narrowed even more. "Why would you come all the way here for that?" she asked, her voice wary. Marcus could feel the tension in her tone, the fear of strangers, especially ones that seemed too good to be true. Richard looked at her, then at Marcus. He sighed, almost like he knew how this might seem. "Because my mother insisted," he said, his voice sincere. "She said your boy deserves better, and she wanted to do something about it." Marcus swallowed, his heart pounding now. He didn't know where this was going, but something told him it was big, bigger than anything they were used to. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to Marcus. "This is just a token of our appreciation," he said. "It's not much, but we want to help." Marcus stared at the envelope. He didn't move, his eyes locked on the white paper that seemed to glow under the harsh sun. He felt his mum stiffen beside him. "No," she said sharply, "we don't take charity." Richard didn't flinch. He kept his hand extended, his eyes on Marcus. "It's not charity, it's gratitude. Please, take it." Marcus looked up at his mum, her face tight, her eyes almost pleading with him to refuse. But he looked back at Richard, and there was something in the man's expression that made him pause. There was no pity, no judgment, just a simple offering. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling, and took the envelope. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Richard nodded, smiling just a little. "You're welcome, Marcus. My mother will be happy to know you accepted it." He turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at Marcus. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He handed Marcus a small card with a number on it. Marcus took it, not sure what to do, but he nodded. Richard walked back to the car, got in, and drove away. Marcus stood there, staring at the envelope in his hand, his mum's eyes burning into him. "Why did you take it?" she asked, her voice tight, almost angry. Marcus looked at her, then at the envelope. He didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't about the money. It was about the way the man had looked at him, the way he had said, "Thank you," like it really mattered. I just felt like I should," Marcus said, shrugging, trying to find the words. His mum shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't need charity, Marcus. We've always managed." Maybe we don't have to just manage anymore," Marcus said softly, his eyes on the envelope. He didn't know what was inside, but whatever it was, it felt like a chance for something different. His mom didn't say anything. She just turned back to the fruit stand, her hands shaking slightly as she rearranged the apples. Marcus slipped the envelope into his pocket, the weight of it heavy but not unwelcome. He could feel the change in the air, the shift in something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. The next morning started like any other, with the noise of the city seeping through the thin walls of the apartment. Marcus woke to the sound of his mum in the kitchen, her movements quiet as she tried not to wake his little sister. He rolled over on the mattress they shared, staring at the ceiling for a moment before he got up. The envelope from yesterday was still in his mind, sitting heavy in his thoughts. "Marcus, get dressed. We need to head out soon," his mum called. Her voice was tired as usual, but there was something else in it too, an edge that hadn't been there before. Marcus sighed, pulling on his clothes. He knew she was still upset about the envelope, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. They left the apartment without saying much, his mom carrying her bag and Marcus pushing the fruit cart. His sister was still asleep, wrapped up in the thin blanket, unaware of everything happening. Marcus wished he could be like that, just sleep and not worry about bills or strange men in suits. As they made their way to the usual spot on the corner, Marcus felt something, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. He pushed the cart down the cracked sidewalk, his eyes scanning the street. The memory of the black car from yesterday was still fresh, and it left him feeling like something else was coming. When they got to their corner, they set up the fruit stand. His mum arranged the bananas and apples while Marcus put out the oranges. The sun was barely up, and already the air was thick and heavy, pressing down on them. His mum didn't look at him, her hands moving fast, her jaw set tight. He knew she was still upset about Richard's visit. "Mum," Marcus started, but she cut him off. "Just focus on the fruit, Marcus. We need to sell today. No more distractions." Marcus nodded, biting back his words. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to make things better, but every time he tried, it seemed like he made it worse. He turned his attention to the street, trying to call out to passing people, hoping someone would buy something. It wasn't until about an hour later that he noticed it. The black car, parked across the street again, the same one from yesterday. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, his eyes locked on the car. He nudged his mum, who was busy rearranging the fruit. "Mum," he said, nodding toward the car. "Look." She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she spotted it. Her face went pale, her lips pressing into a hard line. She turned to Marcus, her voice barely a whisper. "What do they want now?" Marcus shrugged. He didn't know, but his stomach was in knots. The car door opened, and Richard stepped out again, dressed in another suit, looking just as out of place as before. He crossed the street, heading straight for them. Marcus's mum tensed, her hands gripping the edge of the fruit stand. "Morning," Richard said as he approached, giving them a small nod. "What do you want?" Marcus's mum asked, her voice cold. Marcus could hear the fear beneath it, though, the uncertainty. Richard stopped a few feet from them, his hands at his sides, his eyes calm. "I'm sorry to show up again like this," he said, his gaze shifting between Marcus and his mum. "But I wanted to follow up, make sure everything was all right." "We don't need your help," she snapped, her voice rising. A few people passing by glanced their way, curious. Richard held up his hands, his expression soft. "I understand, ma'am, but my mother insisted. She's been thinking about your boy, and she really wanted to make sure you're all right." Marcus felt his face heat up, a mix of embarrassment and something else. He wasn't used to anyone caring about him, let alone some stranger's mother. His mum shook her head, her eyes hard. "We don't need anything from you," she said again, her voice trembling just a little. Richard looked at her, then at Marcus. He took a step closer, his voice dropping so only they could hear. "I know you're proud and I respect that, but this isn't about charity. It's about giving Marcus a chance. He did something good, something that most people wouldn't even think to do. And my mother, she wants him to have a better shot at things." Marcus's mom stayed quiet, her jaw clenched. Marcus swallowed, his heart pounding. He wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure what. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He handed it to Marcus, who took it, his fingers brushing against the thick paper. "That's my number. If you ever need anything at all, you call me," Richard said, his eyes on Marcus. "No strings attached, just think about it, all right?" Marcus nodded, his throat tight. Richard looked at his mum again, gave her a small nod, and then turned, walking back to the car. He got in, and the car drove away, disappearing around the corner. For a long moment, neither Marcus nor his mum said anything. The street noise seemed to fade, and all Marcus could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. He looked down at the card in his hand, the numbers printed neatly in black ink. His mum let out a shaky breath, her eyes on the spot where the car had disappeared. She turned to Marcus, her face tight. "You shouldn't have taken that," she said, her voice low. Marcus looked at her, then back at the card. He didn't know what to say. It felt like an opportunity, like something that could make things better. But his mum's fear was real, and he could see it in her eyes. She was scared of what accepting help might mean, what it might cost them. I just thought maybe—" Marcus started, but she shook her head. "No, Marcus, we don't need favors. We handle our own." Marcus nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. He knew she was right in a way. They had always managed somehow. But it didn't change the feeling in his gut, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. The rest of the day was a blur. Marcus tried to focus on the fruit, on calling out to people, but his eyes kept drifting to the street, to the spot where the black car had been. His mum didn't say much, her face set in a hard mask. Marcus could feel the distance between them, the gap that seemed to widen with every hour that passed. When they finally packed up to go home, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The walk back to the apartment was silent, the cart rattling over the cracked pavement. His mum's shoulders were slumped, her steps slow. Marcus followed, his hands gripping the handle of the cart, his mind still on the card in his pocket. When they got home, the apartment was dark, the electric bill still sitting on the counter. Marcus's sister was awake now, playing with a broken doll they had found at a thrift store. She looked up and smiled at Marcus, her face lighting up. "Marcus, look, I fixed her hair," she said, holding up the doll proudly. Marcus smiled back, ruffling her hair as he walked past. "Nice job, kiddo," he said, his voice softer than before. He glanced at his mum, who was staring at the electric bill again, her eyes distant. He walked over to her, hesitating before he spoke. "Mum, maybe we should at least think about it. I mean, if it could help." She looked at him, her eyes tired but still fierce. She shook her head. "I don't trust it, Marcus. People like that, they don't just give things away." Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew she was scared. He was scared too. But part of him wanted to believe that maybe, just this once, things could be different. "Okay, Mum," he said quietly. "I won't call. Not unless we really need to." She didn't say anything, just turned away, her shoulders sagging. Marcus watched her, his heart heavy. He wanted to make things better. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He reached into his pocket, feeling the edge of the card against his fingers. Maybe he wouldn't call today. Maybe not tomorrow. But something told him that this wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. He looked at his little sister, who was still playing with her doll, her face bright with joy. And he knew that somehow, some way, he would find a way to make things better for her. For all of them. Even if it meant taking a chance. The next day started out with the same rhythm. Sunlight creeping in through the window, the usual shouts from outside, the neighbors' voices echoing through the thin walls of the apartment. Marcus got up, his body feeling heavier than usual. The card from Richard was still in his pocket. He'd kept it there overnight, like it was a reminder. A reminder of what? He didn't exactly know. His mum was already in the kitchen, boiling water for tea. She looked up at him when he walked in, her eyes still tired but softer than the day before. She didn't say anything about the card. She just handed Marcus a slice of bread, and they ate in silence, the air between them thick. "Finish up, Marcus. We need to head to the market," she finally said. Her voice was steady, as if nothing unusual had happened. Marcus nodded, grabbing the crust of bread and shoving it into his mouth before getting ready. He knew what they were about to face, a day just like the last, hoping to sell enough to cover even one of the bills. But today, he had something extra weighing on his mind. As they reached the market, Marcus noticed people giving them sidelong glances, their curiosity evident. The black car wasn't there, but word must have spread. People in this neighborhood loved to talk, and Marcus could feel the whispers, the questions hanging in the air. Who were those people? Why were they looking for Marcus? "Don't mind them," his mum said, her voice low. She must have noticed too. Marcus nodded, though he couldn't help but glance around, feeling eyes on him. He tried to focus on setting up the stand, placing the fruit as neatly as possible, but the thought of the card and the envelope kept tugging at him. By mid-morning, a few people had stopped by to buy some apples and bananas. It was better than yesterday, but not by much. Marcus called out to passers-by, trying to sound enthusiastic, but his heart wasn't in it. His eyes kept drifting to the road, half expecting to see that black car again. "Marcus," his mum said, her voice sharp. He looked up, startled. She was staring at him, her eyes hard. "Stay focused. We need to sell today." "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, looking down at the oranges he was arranging. He felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He wanted to sell, he wanted to help, but it felt like they were stuck. Stuck in this same cycle, day after day, no way out. His mum was right. They had always managed. But what if managing wasn't enough anymore? What if there was a chance to do more than just survive? He thought of the card again, the way Richard had looked at him, not with pity, but with something else. Respect, maybe. Like he believed Marcus could actually do something. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice low. She didn't look at him, her eyes on the street searching for customers. "About the card. I know you don't trust it, but maybe we could at least talk to him, see what he really wants." She stiffened, her hands pausing over the fruit. For a moment she didn't say anything, and Marcus could feel the tension in the air between them. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, maybe even regret. "You don't understand, Marcus," she said, her voice shaking. "People like that, they always want something in return. There's no such thing as free help. They'll use you, and when they're done, they'll leave us worse off than we were before." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. He knew she was scared. He was scared too. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the feeling that this was different. Richard hadn't seemed like the kind of person who wanted anything. He had looked at Marcus like he mattered, like he was worth something. "I know, Mum," Marcus said quietly. I just think maybe we should find out for ourselves. Maybe this is our chance to get out of this, to make things better." His mum shook her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And what if it isn't? What if we lose everything?" Marcus didn't know what to say. He looked down at the ground, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. He didn't know if it would. He just knew that he couldn't keep doing this, watching his mum struggle, feeling like he was helpless. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They sold some fruit, but not enough. When the sun started to dip below the buildings, they began to pack up, the cart lighter but still heavy with the weight of what they hadn't sold. Marcus's mum was quiet, her eyes downcast, her hands moving slowly as she packed the last of the oranges into the box. "Let's go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, grabbing the handle of the cart and following her down the street. The walk home felt longer than usual, the cart's wheels rattling against the cracked sidewalk. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything they hadn't said. When they got home, Marcus's little sister was waiting for them. She ran up to Marcus, her small arms wrapping around his waist. He smiled, ruffling her hair. "Hey, kiddo, you been good?" he asked, his voice softer. She nodded, her eyes bright. "I drew a picture, Marcus. Wanna see?" "Of course," Marcus said, letting her lead him to the small table where a piece of paper was laid out. It was a drawing of their family, Marcus, his mum, and his sister, all holding hands. The sun was shining above them, and there was a big black car in the background. Marcus felt his heart clench at the sight. He looked at his mum, who was standing by the counter, her eyes on the drawing. She looked at Marcus, her expression unreadable. "See, Marcus? I drew the car that came to see you," his sister said, her voice filled with excitement. She didn't understand, and Marcus wished he could keep it that way, keep her innocent, keep her from knowing just how hard things were. "Yeah, it's a good drawing," Marcus said, his voice thick. He smiled at her, though it felt forced. He glanced at his mom, who was watching him, her eyes filled with something like resignation. After dinner, another thin soup, just enough to take the edge off their hunger, Marcus sat at the table, the card still in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the numbers printed neatly in black ink. He could hear his mum in the other room, putting his sister to bed, her voice soft as she hummed a lullaby. He knew what his mum had said. He knew she was scared, and that there was a chance she was right. But he also knew that they couldn't keep going like this. They needed help, and maybe, just maybe, this was the help they needed. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stood up and walked over to the small phone they kept in the kitchen. It was old, the buttons worn from use, but it still worked. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding. Then, before he could change his mind, he picked it up and dialed the number on the card. It rang once, twice, and then there was a click. A voice came on the other end, calm and familiar. "Hello?" Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. "Hi, it's Marcus, from the market. You gave me your card." There was a pause, and then Richard's voice came through, warm and relieved. "Marcus, I'm glad you called. I was hoping you would." Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the door of the other room, where his mum's voice had gone quiet. He knew this was a risk. He knew it could all go wrong, but he also knew that he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I need your help." Richard's voice was steady, comforting. "Of course, Marcus. Whatever you need. Let's talk, okay?" Marcus nodded, even though Richard couldn't see him. He felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but at least he was doing something. At least he was trying. Okay, Marcus said, his voice stronger now. Let's talk. The next morning, the tension in the apartment was almost suffocating. Marcus woke up, his eyes still heavy from lack of sleep, his mind replaying the call with Richard over and over again. He knew he had made a decision that would change everything, but he still didn't know how his mum would take it. She was in the kitchen, moving about as usual, but Marcus could tell from her silence that something was off. She hadn't looked at him much since they'd gotten home the previous night, and now, as they prepared to head out to the market, she didn't say anything at all. "Marcus, hurry up. We've got to go," she finally said, her voice clipped. She wasn't looking at him, her eyes focused on tying her apron strings. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding as he grabbed his sneakers and slipped them on. His little sister was still asleep, her small form bundled up under the blanket. He glanced at her innocent face, and knew that whatever he did, it had to be for her. They left the apartment, the sun barely peeking over the buildings, casting a dull orange glow over the cracked sidewalks. Marcus pushed the cart down the street, his mum walking ahead of him. She still hadn't said anything about the envelope or the card, and Marcus knew she was trying to ignore what had happened, trying to make it go away, but it wouldn't go away, and Marcus knew it. They reached the corner and started setting up. Marcus could feel the stares again, the whispers that drifted on the wind from the people passing by. He ignored them, keeping his eyes on the fruit, setting it up as neatly as possible. He didn't want to look at his mum, didn't want to see the fear in her eyes. And then, just as they were finishing, Marcus saw the car, the black car, parked at the corner, the sun glinting off its roof. His stomach dropped, his hands pausing over the crate of apples. He saw the door open, and Richard stepped out, his suit sharp, his expression calm. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Mom," he said, barely managing to get the word out. She looked up, following his gaze to where Richard was walking towards them. Her face went pale, her hands clenching the edge of the fruit stand. She turned to Marcus, her eyes wide. "Did you—" she started, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. "I called him," he said, his voice low. I think he can help." She shook her head, stepping back, her eyes filled with panic. "Marcus, no, I told you." Richard reached them then, his eyes moving from Marcus to his mum. He gave her a small nod, his expression apologetic. "Mum, I know this must be a lot," he said, his voice gentle, "but I promise, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to help." She glared at him, her hands trembling as she spoke. "We don't need your help. We can handle our own." Richard nodded, his eyes understanding. "I respect that, ma'am. I really do. But sometimes, even the strongest people need a little support. I'm not here to take anything away from you. I just want to give Marcus a chance." Marcus's mom didn't say anything, her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus looked at her, his heart pounding. He wanted her to see that this wasn't just about money. It was about more than that. It was about hope, about not having to live with that electric bill sitting on the counter, about his little sister not going to bed hungry. "Mum, please," Marcus said, his voice cracking. Just hear him out." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "And what if this goes wrong, Marcus? What if we lose everything?" Richard stepped closer, his eyes on her. "I'm not here to take anything from you, I promise. I'm here because Marcus deserves a chance, because you all deserve better." She stared at him, her lips trembling. Marcus could see the fear in her eyes, the way she was trying to protect them. But he also saw something else, something that looked like exhaustion, like she was tired of fighting, tired of holding everything together on her own. Finally, she looked at Marcus, her eyes searching his. "You really think this is the right thing, Marcus?" Marcus swallowed, nodding. "I do, Mom. I really do." She took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping as she let it out. She looked at Richard, her voice shaky. "Okay, we'll hear you out." Richard smiled, his eyes soft. "Thank you. I promise you won't regret this." They stood there, the air thick with everything that had just happened. Marcus felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. He knew this wasn't the end of their problems, but maybe it was the beginning of something different, something better. "Why don't we sit down somewhere?" Richard suggested, glancing around. There's a small cafe down the street. My treat. Marcus's mom hesitated, then nodded slowly. Marcus could see her hands still shaking, but she took a step forward, her eyes on Richard. All right, she said. Let's go. The walk to the cafe was quiet, Marcus pushing the fruit cart behind them, his mum walking beside Richard. Marcus watched them, the way his mum kept glancing at Richard, her eyes wary, her steps slow. He knew this was hard for her. He knew she was scared, but she was doing it anyway, for him, for his sister, and that meant everything. They reached the cafe, a small place with chipped paint on the sign and tables that looked like they had seen better days. Richard pulled out a chair for Marcus's mum, and she sat down slowly, her eyes on him the whole time. Marcus took a seat beside her, his hands in his lap. Richard sat across from them, giving them both a small smile. I know this is a lot, he started, his voice soft. And I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I just want to help. Marcus did something that really moved my mother, and she insisted that I do something in return. Marcus's mum didn't say anything, her eyes on the table, her lips pressed together. Richard continued, his eyes on Marcus now. You're a good kid, Marcus. You didn't have to help my mother, but you did. And that tells me a lot about the kind of person you are. Marcus felt his face heat up, a mix of embarrassment and pride. He glanced at his mom, who was still staring at the table, her hands clasped tightly. Richard reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. He set it on the table in front of Marcus's mom. This is for you, he said, his voice steady. It's not charity. It's a thank you. Use it however you need, to pay bills, to buy food, whatever will make things easier. She looked at the envelope, her eyes wide. Marcus could see the struggle on her face, the fear, the pride, the uncertainty. She looked at Richard, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? Richard smiled, his eyes soft. Because I know what it's like to need a little help. And because Marcus deserves a chance. You all do. She stared at him, then at Marcus. Finally, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the envelope. She didn't open it, just held it in her lap, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what else to say. Richard nodded, his smile gentle. You don't have to say anything. Just take care of yourselves. And if you need anything at all, you call me. Marcus looked at his mom, then at Richard. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe things could get better. Maybe this was their chance. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice strong. We will. They sat there for a moment longer, the air between them shifting, the weight of everything they had carried slowly lifting. Marcus knew this wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The walk back from the cafe was quieter, but it felt different from before. The tension in the air between Marcus and his mum had softened just a little. She still hadn't looked at the envelope, just kept it clutched in her hand, her knuckles white from the grip. Richard had offered to give them a ride back, but Marcus's mum had refused. She said she needed time to think, to walk. They reached their usual corner, the fruit cart waiting for them, just as they had left it. His mum let out a long breath, her eyes on the fruit, but her mind clearly elsewhere. Marcus stood beside her, his hands jammed into his pockets. He wanted to say something, anything, but he didn't know how to break the silence. His mum finally looked at him, her eyes red but steady. All right, Marcus, she said quietly. We'll use this money, but we're going to do it smart. We'll pay what's most important first. No wasting it, no taking anything for granted, you understand? Marcus nodded, a rush of relief washing over him. I understand, Mum, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew how much it had taken for her to get to this point. He could see the fear in her eyes, the hesitation. She was still scared, still unsure, but she was willing to try, and that meant everything. Let's finish the day here, she said, turning back to the stand, and then we'll go home and figure things out. Marcus helped her set up again, the usual rhythm of their work feeling lighter now. He could feel the difference. The weight that had been there for so long was starting to lift, even if just a little. They sold a few more apples, some bananas, the day slowly passing by. His mum was quiet, her eyes distant, but Marcus could see her shoulders relaxing, her movements less tense. When the sun started to dip low, they packed up the stand, Marcus pushing the cart while his mom walked beside him. The envelope was still in her hand, and every so often she would glance down at it, her lips pressed together. They walked home, the noise of the city fading as they moved through the quieter streets. When they reached the apartment, Marcus's little sister ran to them, her eyes bright. She hugged Marcus, then looked up at their mom, her small face scrunched in confusion as she saw the envelope. "What's that, Mom?" she asked, her voice innocent. Their mom looked down at her, her eyes softening. It's a little help, sweetie," she said, "to make things easier." His sister didn't seem to understand, but she nodded, smiling. "Okay. Can we have something nice for dinner?" Marcus's mom looked at Marcus, then down at the envelope. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, baby, we can have something nice for dinner." Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched as his mom walked to the small table, setting the envelope down gently, almost like she was afraid of it. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Marcus held his breath, watching as she pulled out a stack of bills. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to pay the electric bill, to buy some proper groceries, to ease the pressure that had been on them for so long. His mom let out a shaky breath, her eyes closing for a moment. "Okay," she whispered. "We can do this." They went to the small store down the street, Marcus pushing the cart with his sister hanging onto the side, her excitement palpable. His mom bought things they hadn't had in weeks: milk, bread, a bit of meat. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough to feel like a feast. When they got back, Marcus's mom cooked dinner, her movements more relaxed, her shoulders less hunched. The smell of the meat filled the apartment, and Marcus felt his stomach rumble, the warmth of the moment making everything feel a little more bearable. They sat down to eat, his sister laughing as she talked about her day, her doll, and the friends she had made. Marcus watched his mum, her eyes soft as she listened, a small smile on her lips. She looked up at Marcus, catching his gaze, and gave him a nod. A nod that said, "Thank you," without words. A nod that meant she was willing to try. After dinner, they sat together, the envelope still on the table. Marcus's mum took a deep breath, her eyes on Marcus. "We need to be careful, Marcus," she said. "This isn't going to last forever. We have to use it wisely. And I need you to promise me that you won't expect more from this man. This is all we take, okay?" Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He knew what she meant. She was afraid of relying on someone else, afraid of what it might mean, but he also knew that this was a chance to make things better, even if just for a little while. "I promise, Mum," he said. "We'll use it to make things better. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then she nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "Okay, let's make it count." They made a plan that night. They would pay the electric bill first, then buy some more supplies for the stand. They would use what they needed, and they would save what they could. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start. The next morning, they woke up to a new day, the weight on their shoulders a little lighter. Marcus watched his mum as she moved around the apartment, her steps quicker, her face less strained. She even smiled at him, a real smile, the kind he hadn't seen in a long time. "Come on, Marcus," she said, her voice lighter. "Let's get going. We've got work to do." Marcus nodded, grabbing the fruit crate. His little sister ran up to him, her eyes wide. "Can I come today, Marcus? Please?" He looked at his mum, who hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you stay close to us, okay?" His sister nodded, her face lighting up. "I will, I promise." They walked to the market together, Marcus pushing the cart, his sister skipping beside him, her small hand clutching his. His mom walked beside them, the envelope no longer a weight in her hand, but a promise of something better. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were going to change. They set up the stand, the sun rising high above them, the city coming to life. People walked by, some stopping to buy fruit, others just glancing at the stand. Marcus's sister stayed close, her eyes wide as she watched everything around her, her excitement infectious. Richard didn't come that day, and Marcus was glad. He knew his mum needed time, they all did, but he also knew that he wasn't done with Richard. Not yet. There was something about the way Richard had looked at him, the way he had offered his help without asking for anything in return, that made Marcus believe this wasn't the end. "Marcus," his mum called, breaking through his thoughts. He turned, seeing her holding out a banana to a customer, her smile real, her eyes bright. He smiled back, nodding as he walked over, ready to help. The day passed in a blur of activity, the fruit stand busier than usual, their spirits higher. His mum even laughed at one point, her voice ringing out over the noise of the market. Marcus looked at her, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the sun began to set, they packed up the stand, Marcus pushing the cart, his sister hanging onto the side, her laughter filling the air. His mum walked beside him, her steps light, her face relaxed. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were a family, not just surviving, but living, even if just for a moment. When they got home, the apartment didn't feel as small. The electric bill had been paid, the fridge had food, and there was a sense of something new in the air. Something that made Marcus believe that maybe, just maybe, they could do this, that they could make things better. His mom looked at him as they sat down for dinner, her eyes soft. "We're going to be okay, Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "We'll make it work." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling. "Yeah, Mum, we will." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work and small triumphs. Marcus could feel a change, not just in the air, but in himself. His mum seemed lighter too, her steps no longer weighed down by the same crushing worries. The money from Richard had helped them pay the bills, stock up on groceries, and make a few much-needed repairs to their tiny apartment. It wasn't luxury, but it was comfort, something Marcus wasn't used to, but could definitely get used to. Marcus and his mom walked to their corner early one morning, Marcus pushing the cart filled with fresh fruit. His little sister skipped beside them, excited to join her big brother at work. The air was crisp, and the sunlight broke through the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the street. For once, things felt good. The familiar knot of fear in Marcus's stomach had loosened, and for the first time, he felt like things were going to be okay. "Marcus, remember, keep an eye on your sister," his mum said as they set up. She gave him a small smile, her eyes more relaxed than they'd been in weeks. Marcus nodded, grabbing a bunch of bananas and placing them in a neat row. "I got it, Mum, don't worry," he said, his voice steady. His sister, meanwhile, was bouncing on her toes, looking around at all the people and stands around them. "Can I help, Marcus?" she asked, her eyes wide. Marcus looked at her and smiled, handing her an apple. "Sure, you can help me keep these apples organized. Just make sure no one takes one without paying, all right?" She nodded eagerly, her small hands cradling the apple as if it was something precious. Marcus chuckled, feeling a warmth in his chest that made him forget just for a moment all the worries and hardships they'd faced. The morning went well. People stopped by the stand, buying fruit and chatting with Marcus and his mom. His sister did her best to help, offering the apples to anyone who approached, her smile bright. Marcus could see how people responded to her, their faces softening as they saw her enthusiasm. Even some of the usual grumpy faces that walked by every day had a hint of a smile today. "Looks like we're doing pretty well today, huh?" Marcus said, glancing at his mom. She nodded, her face relaxed. "Yeah, we are," she said, her voice quiet but filled with something like hope. She looked at Marcus, her eyes soft. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." Marcus shrugged, but he could feel the lump in his throat, the emotion welling up. He didn't want to get all choked up, not here, not now. But her words meant everything to him. "I just want to help, Mom. We're in this together, right?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Always." Around midday, a man in a suit approached the stand. Marcus tensed at first, but he quickly recognized the man. It wasn't Richard, but someone else. He wore a similar kind of suit, though, crisp and polished, and he looked out of place in their neighborhood. "Good morning," the man said, nodding politely to Marcus and his mum. "I'm looking for Marcus." Marcus blinked, taken by surprise. Yeah, that's me." The man smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. He handed it to Marcus, who took it, frowning in confusion. "I work with Mr. Richard. He's asked me to stop by and see if everything is all right, and to let you know that his offer still stands. If you need anything at all, you can reach him directly." Marcus looked at the card, his fingers running over the embossed letters. He glanced at his mum, who was watching the man warily, her lips pressed tight. Marcus knew she was still cautious, still afraid of what accepting more help could mean. "Thank you," Marcus said, slipping the card into his pocket. "We're all right for now." The man nodded, his smile warm. "I'm glad to hear that. Just know that Mr. Richard is very invested in making sure you're all okay. He wanted me to make sure you knew that." With that, the man turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, his mind spinning. His mum sighed, her shoulders slumping a little. "They won't just go away, will they?" she said, her voice soft. Marcus shook his head, unsure how to respond. "I don't think so, Mum, but maybe that's okay," he said, glancing at her. "They're just trying to help." She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I just don't want to owe anyone anything, Marcus. I don't want them to take something from us." Marcus reached out, touching her arm gently. "I know, Mum, but maybe it's okay to let people help. We've been through a lot. Maybe it's time to accept it." She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. The rest of the day passed without incident. They sold more fruit than usual, and by the time the sun was beginning to set, the crate was almost empty. Marcus's mum looked at the nearly bare stand, her lips curving into a small smile. "Looks like we did good today," she said, her voice filled with pride. Marcus nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we did," he said, glancing at his sister, who was still happily arranging the last few apples. As they packed up, Marcus couldn't help but think about Richard and the man in the suit. He knew his mum was scared, but part of him felt a growing sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break they needed. Maybe Richard's interest in them wasn't something to fear, but something that could actually change their lives. They got home, and Marcus helped his mom put away the remaining fruit. She cooked dinner, a simple but hearty stew, and they sat down together at the small table. His little sister was chattering excitedly about all the people she had seen at the market, her laughter filling the room. After dinner, Marcus's mom took out the envelope, counting what was left. She looked at Marcus, her eyes softening. "We're gonna save this," she said, "just in case. We're doing better, but we need to be smart." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling. He could see the determination in her eyes, the strength that had always been there, even when things were at their worst. And now, he saw something else too, hope. "Of course, Mum, we'll make it work," he said. That night, as Marcus lay on the mattress he shared with his sister, he stared at the ceiling, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the business card the man had given him. He turned it over in his fingers, the weight of it heavy in his palm. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had a choice. Like there was a way out, a chance to make things better for his mum, for his sister, for all of them. He closed his eyes, tucking the card back into his pocket, and let out a long breath. They were going to be okay. They had to be. And whatever came next, Marcus knew he was ready for it. The next morning came slowly. The sun barely peeked through the dusty window, casting a dim light across the small room. Marcus woke up, his sister still curled up beside him, her breathing slow and steady. He carefully slid out from under the blanket, not wanting to wake her, and walked into the kitchen. His mom was already up, standing by the counter, her eyes on the electric bill they had paid only a few days earlier. Marcus could see the way her shoulders were hunched, the worry creeping back in, despite everything that had happened. He walked over, leaning against the counter beside her. "We're going to be okay, Mom," he said, his voice soft. She looked at him, her eyes tired but warm. "I know, Marcus, She trailed off, her eyes dropping back to the paper. "I just keep wondering if this is really going to last. If we're really going to be okay this time." Marcus swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "We will. We have to." She nodded, squeezing his hand before letting go, her fingers brushing against the paper. "You've always been so much like him, you know," she said. her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus blinked, confused. Like who? Your father, she said, her eyes softening as she looked at him. He always wanted to make things better for us. He was always fighting, always trying, just like you. Marcus didn't know what to say. He looked down at the counter, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He hadn't heard her talk about his dad in a long time, not since he was little, when things were different, before everything had fallen apart. What was he like? Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. He had memories, but they were small things, flashes of laughter, the feel of strong hands lifting him into the air. He wanted more. He wanted to know the man he barely remembered. His mum took a deep breath, her eyes distant as she spoke. He was brave. He always stood up for what he thought was right. He wanted a better life for us, for you and your sister. He was a dreamer, Marcus, just like you. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a mix of pride and sadness filling him. He looked at his mom, her eyes glassy, lost in thought. I wish he was still here, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Me too, Marcus. Every day. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of his father's absence settling between them. Then Marcus straightened, his resolve hardening. I'm going to do what he wanted, Mum. I'm going to make things better for us. I promise. His mum looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. She nodded, her lips curving into a small, sad smile. I know you will, Marcus. I believe in you. Later that day, Marcus found himself sitting in the narrow alley behind their building, staring at the business card Richard's associate had given him. He turned it over in his fingers, the embossed letters catching the sunlight. He wanted to do something. He wanted to make things better, just like he had promised. But he wasn't sure how. He wasn't sure if calling Richard again was the right move. His mum's voice echoed in his head, her fear of relying on others, of getting hurt. He didn't want to make things worse, but he also didn't want to just sit here, waiting for things to fall apart again. Hey, Marcus! A voice called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his friend Tommy approaching, his hands shoved into his pockets. What are you doing out here? Marcus shrugged, slipping the card back into his pocket. Just thinking. Tommy sat down beside him, his eyes curious. About what? About my dad, Marcus said, surprising himself. He usually didn't talk about his father, especially not with Tommy. But something about the conversation he'd had with his mom that morning made it feel like it was time. Tommy looked at him, his expression serious. Yeah? What about him? Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes on the ground. About how he always wanted things to be better for us, and about how I'm trying to do the same. Tommy nodded, his eyes distant. I get that, man. My mom's always talking about my dad too, about how he used to take care of us before, well, you know. Marcus nodded, a pang of understanding passing between them. They both knew what it was like to lose someone, to carry that weight every single day. It wasn't easy, but it was part of who they were. You think we can really make things better? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy looked at him, his eyes steady. I think we have to try. That's all we can do. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. He pulled the card out of his pocket again, looking at it for a long moment. Then, before he could change his mind, he pulled out the old beat-up phone from his pocket and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Hello? Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. Hi, it's Marcus. I was wondering if maybe we could talk. There was a pause, and then Richard's voice came through, warm and welcoming. Of course, Marcus. I'm glad you called. What's on your mind? Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Tommy, who gave him a nod of encouragement. I want to make things better for my family, and I think maybe you can help. Richard's voice softened. I'm here to help, Marcus. Whatever you need. Why don't you come by my office sometime? We can talk about what we can do. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded, even though Richard couldn't see him. Yeah, okay. I'll come by. They agreed on a time, and Marcus hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Tommy, who raised an eyebrow. You really think this guy's for real? Tommy asked, his voice cautious. Marcus shrugged. I don't know, but I have to find out. I can't just sit here and wait for things to get worse. I have to try. Tommy nodded, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. Well, whatever happens, I got your back. Thanks, Tommy, Marcus said, his voice sincere. That means a lot. The next morning, Marcus got up early, dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much, just a clean pair of jeans and a t-shirt that didn't have any holes. He told his mum where he was going, and she nodded, her face serious. Be careful, Marcus, she said, her voice filled with worry. Don't trust too easily. I won't, Mom, I promise, he said, giving her a reassuring smile. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the hope, the belief that maybe this time things would be different. He walked to the address Richard had given him, his heart pounding as he approached the building. It was bigger than anything Marcus had ever seen up close, the glass windows reflecting the bright morning sun. He swallowed, trying to steady himself as he walked through the doors. The receptionist looked at him, her eyes kind as she smiled. You must be Marcus, she said. Mr. Richard is expecting you. Go ahead, his office is on the 4th floor. Marcus nodded, thanking her before stepping into the elevator. His stomach twisted as he rode up, the numbers lighting up one by one. He was nervous, but he was also ready. He had to be. For his mum, for his sister, for his dad. When he reached Richard's office, the door was open, and Richard stood there, smiling warmly as Marcus stepped in. Marcus, it's good to see you, he said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, his grip firm. Thanks for seeing me, Mr. Richard. Please, call me Richard, he said, motioning for Marcus to sit down. Now let's talk about how we can make things better for you and your family. They talked for what felt like hours, Richard listening as Marcus told him about their struggles, about his mum, about everything they'd been through. Richard nodded, his eyes understanding, his voice steady as he spoke. Marcus, I want to help you. I want to give you a chance. You have potential, and I see that. I see your courage, your determination, and I want to support you however I can. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a mix of hope and fear filling him. He wanted to believe Richard. He wanted to believe that this was the break they needed. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice cracking. I just want to do right by my family. Richard smiled, his eyes soft. And you will, Marcus. I'm here to help you make that happen. As Marcus left the office later, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He knew there was still a long road ahead, still a lot of uncertainty. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. And for the first time, he felt like he was stepping in the right direction. The next few weeks brought changes that Marcus never thought he would see. The partnership with Richard started to make a real difference in their lives, though it wasn't about riches or instant comfort. It was about stability, a steady current that allowed Marcus and his family to catch their breath for the first time in a long while. Richard had made good on his word. He offered to help Marcus's mum cover the rent for a few months, ensuring they wouldn't have to live with the constant fear of losing their home. He also provided some contacts for suppliers, so they could get fresher fruit at a better price for their stand. It was small, practical things that added up, slowly transforming their situation. Marcus, on his part, started spending his afternoons helping Richard out, not in a way that made him feel like he owed him, but in a way that made him feel like he was earning something. He was running errands, organizing files, sometimes even helping Richard with minor tasks at the office. It made Marcus feel responsible, like he had a place in this strange new world of business people and polished offices. The money from the fruit stand now stretched further. His mom was able to keep some aside in an envelope for emergencies, and they finally had enough to keep the fridge stocked without worrying about the next meal. It wasn't wealth, but it was safety. It was enough. One day, after another busy morning at the market, Marcus and his mum walked back to their apartment, with his sister skipping along beside them. His mum's face looked different lately, more relaxed, less creased with worry. Marcus noticed it, and it made him feel proud. As they walked, his mum looked over at him, her eyes searching. "You've been doing good, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet. He looked at her, surprised. "Thanks, Mum." She smiled at him, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I know I was scared before, about Richard, about letting anyone help, but you made a good choice, Marcus. You really did." Marcus nodded, swallowing the emotion that was building in his chest. "I just want us to be okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And we are," she said. "We're getting there." When they got back home, Marcus's little sister ran into the apartment, her laughter echoing through the small space. Marcus set down the crate of unsold fruit, which wasn't much. They'd done well today. His mum looked around, her eyes taking in the apartment. It still wasn't much. 2 rooms, peeling paint. But now it felt more like home. There wasn't the same sense of looming danger that they might lose it all. For the first time in a long time, they felt secure. "Marcus," his mum said suddenly, her voice steady but hesitant. He looked up at her, curious. She glanced at the envelope they kept on the shelf, the one that had slowly started to fill with extra cash. "I was thinking, maybe it's time we made a plan for you, for school, for the future." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" She smiled softly. "You're smart, Marcus. You should be thinking about what comes next, about going back to school, about doing something that makes you happy. I don't want you stuck like this forever. You deserve more." He felt his heart tighten, a mix of hope and fear. The thought of going back to school, of having the freedom to dream beyond just surviving, it was something he hadn't dared to imagine for a long time. He looked at his mum, her eyes filled with hope and love, and he nodded slowly. "Yeah, Mum, I'd like that," he said, his voice trembling. He could see the pride in her eyes, the way she nodded in response, her lips curving into a small smile. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Together." The next day, Marcus found himself back at Richard's office, sitting across from him as they went over some simple tasks. Richard looked up at him, his eyes warm. "How are things at home, Marcus?" Marcus smiled, something he was doing more often lately. "They're better, Mr. Richard. Really better." Richard nodded, leaning back in his chair. "That's good to hear. And what about you? What do you want to do next?" Marcus hesitated, thinking about his mum's words, about the possibilities that were starting to open up in front of him. He took a deep breath, meeting Richard's gaze. "I want to go back to school," he said. "I want to do something that makes a difference, for my family, for myself." Richard smiled, his eyes shining with approval. "I think that's a great idea, Marcus. You've got potential, and I'd be more than happy to help you get there. Whatever you need, just let me know." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude, his heart swelling. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had control over it, like he had a say in what came next. Over the following weeks, Marcus and his mom worked together to make things happen. They talked about schools, about how they could use the money Richard had given them to pay for his education. Marcus started studying again, borrowing books from the library, brushing up on subjects he'd missed while he'd been helping at the market. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. One evening, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table, a math textbook open in front of him, his little sister climbed up onto the chair beside him. She looked at the pages, her eyes wide. "What's that, Marcus?" He smiled, pulling her closer. "It's math, kiddo. I'm studying so I can go back to school." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with awe. "Are you going to be a teacher?" Marcus laughed softly, shaking his head. "No, not a teacher. But maybe I can do something that helps other people. Maybe I can be someone who makes a difference." She nodded, her small hand resting on his arm. "You're already the best, Marcus." He felt a warmth spread through him, his heart swelling with love for his sister. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." The next day, Marcus and his mom stood in line at the local community center. They were there to enroll Marcus in a program that would help him catch up with his studies and prepare for returning to school. Marcus could feel the nerves in his stomach, but they were mixed with excitement. He was taking a step forward, a real step towards something better. His mum looked at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You're going to do great, Marcus. I know you are." He nodded, smiling at her. "I'll do my best, Mum, for all of us." When they finally reached the front of the line, Marcus filled out the paperwork, his hand steady as he wrote his name, as he committed to this new path. The woman behind the desk smiled at him, handing him a packet of information. "Welcome to the program, Marcus. We're glad to have you." As they walked out of the community center, Marcus felt something shift inside him. He looked at his mum, her face relaxed, her eyes filled with hope. He looked at the world around him, the people going about their day, and he felt a sense of belonging, a sense that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. A few weeks later, Marcus found himself back at the market, helping his mom with the stand. But things were different now. They weren't just trying to get by. They were building something. He had a plan, a future that stretched out in front of him, filled with possibilities. Richard stopped by that day, dressed in his usual suit, his smile warm as he approached the stand. "How's it going, Marcus?" Marcus grinned, extending his hand. "It's going great, Mr. Richard. Thanks to you." Richard shook his hand, his eyes filled with pride. "You did this, Marcus. I just gave you a little push." Marcus nodded, feeling the truth of Richard's words. He had taken that step, he had made the choice, and now he was living it. As the sun began to set, Marcus and his mum packed up the stand. His sister was already running ahead, her laughter echoing through the narrow streets. Marcus looked at his mum, her face soft in the fading light. "Thank you, Mum," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes filled with love. "For what, Marcus?" "For believing in me, for letting me try," he said. She smiled, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "You're my son. I've always believed in you." As they walked home, the city alive with noise and movement, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He knew there would still be challenges, still be struggles, but he also knew they had each other, they had hope, and they had a future, and for Marcus, that was more than enough.